Welcome to the Original Gangsters Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. A very, very special edition of the Original Gangsters, both the podcast as well as the Patreon members only. This is going to be the start of a series that we do where we get people from opposite ends of a legal conflict or a mob war in some cases. And we're going to get them after decades of not seeing each other and get them at the table to hash out stuff that happened back in the day and get some perspective. Today, we're going to be discussing the 1996 Operation Game Tax case, which is the biggest prosecution of the Detroit Mafia in the history of the Tocco's early crime family. And we have a former member of the crime family who was in that case, Nove Tocco. Thank you for joining us, Nove.
You're welcome, Scott. Good afternoon.
And then we have a prosecutor on the case, Rick Convertino, who is a legendary mob buster here in Detroit. And he put Nove away. And Nove and Rick haven't seen each other in literally 30 years. And this is the first time that they've been in the same room since Nove was convicted back in 1998. So it's been 27 years. And we're just going to kind of chop it up and see where we go. So thank you for joining us, Rick.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I guess I'll throw it to Rick first and just kind of maybe talk about the background and how you got involved in going after the Tocco's early crime family. And that 96 game tax case was a sledgehammer. It didn't kill the crime family, but it definitely, it knocked them down for us, for a significant period of time. All the administrators went to prison. It was 16 people. The case dated back almost 25 years of activity, going all the way back to Las Vegas. And just kind of tell us about how you got introduced to it.
To the case itself?
Yeah, how did you get put onto the case?
Well, I was a member of the Organized Crime Strike Force in Detroit in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I started my career with Main Justice in the Organized Crime and Racketeering section in 1989. And I was assigned, among other areas, to come to Detroit to assist the Organized Crime Strike Forces in cases that were lagging in the strike force at the time.
And you were a New Yorker, right?
I'm from New York. Yep. I'm from Endicott, New York. And I can tell you some interesting stories about being from Endicott, New York, if you'd like, which have a connection to Detroit as well.
Yes, let's do that later on in the episode.
So I was traveling to Detroit and working on cases that were not being attended to by the strike force from Main Justice. And one of the cases that I had been repeatedly asked to assist on was Gam Tax. And I had absolutely no interest in doing that. I was kind of typecast as a young Italian kid who would be great at working on OC cases. And it just wasn't anything that, based on my historical background, it wasn't anything that really was exciting to me. But how I got on the case was there was an attorney on the case who was on the case on Gam Tax a long time and was extraordinarily unproductive. It was the only case he was assigned to. He wasn't doing his share of the load, and so the chief of the strike force was concerned. And then finally, when the case was coming to trial, that attorney said he needed to have hip replacement surgery, needed to be relieved of his duties. So the chief of the strike force came to me and said, look, I really need you to get on this case, take over. He wanted me to take the lead with Angelo Polizzi.
That was one of one of the first dominoes to kind of fall in building Game Tax.
Yes.
Was the son of consigliere of the family, Mike Polizzi. His son, who was an attorney,
Yes,
got caught up in
DWI case in Ann Arbor.
And then there was also, he owned a like I
Yeah.
believed, in St. Clair Shores with an ex-Purple Ganger's son. And they were,
he flipped, like an old suitcase in about 30 seconds.
he wasn't a gangster. I mean,
No, he wasn't a gangster. He was a graduate of Notre Dame Law
Right.
School. And, it depends on what day you caught him, whether he was a gangster or not.
He was Jack Tocco's godson.
Yes.
as well. And Jack Tocco was the boss.
So the attorney in the strike force who was primarily responsible for presenting that part of the case, was looking for an out, and he got an out. He said he needed surgery in his hip, and it was unavoidable. So the strike force chief came to me, and he kept asking me to do it. I was adamantly opposed. I just didn't have any interest in doing it. I was doing other interesting cases in the strike force at the time that I was involved in heavily. And so I told him, well, look, if I do that for you, I need you to help me with this terrorism case. And so he agreed. And so that's how I got on Gamtex.
It's interesting when you look at the timeline, and maybe get Nove to chime in here. So Jimmy Hoffa disappears in 1975, and even though there's never any case that's brought in the Hoffa kidnapping and murder case, there seemed to be an impetus at that point to, even if we can't get everybody that was involved in murdering Jimmy Hoffa, we're going to get them somehow and put them in prison. So there was like this kind of full court press, let's say from like 75 to like 81, 82, where there were a bunch of cases. And then there was like a lull. Yeah. There was like 10 years or so, or more, 10 to 15 years, where there just weren't really cases being built against the Detroit LCN.
That's right. That's right. And it wasn't for the lack of OLR, officer labor racketeering in the department. It wasn't for
lack of activity, because at that point, you can chime in here, but in the 80s, that they were still a very functional, powerful group.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, they hadn't faded into the shadows like they kind of have now, where they still exist, but not at the level that they did in the past.
I have one correction. I went down in the 80s. In the late 80s.
You went down in a case. Okay.
But I didn't have a trial. We pled guilty. In fact, one of Mr. Cavantino's associates on that case prosecuted me, David Morris.
Oh, yeah. And that was the last case he prosecuted.
Was that right?
Probably so, except for Gamtex. Yeah.
Was that right?
They just couldn't get him off the dime. That whole strike force was the purpose of the strike force was Gamtex. Really, it was the focus of the strike force. It was the focus of the attendant agents working with the strike force and the IRS agents who were working with the strike. It was solely and almost exclusively Gamtex. So if there were any issues that would arise regarding funding or regarding use of resources, that's what the reply would be. Gamtex. We're focused on Gamtex, and that's why there was so much inactivity at the time.
And let me throw something else at you, and if you don't feel comfortable talking about it, I get it. Doing my research and digging into FBI intelligence documents and court files, and trying to get a blueprint of how the case was built, it seemed like, from the perspective of a researcher, that there was a lot of attention being put on, and this was like 10, 15 years before the case dropped, but it looked like there was a lot of attention being put on a Toledo mobster associate of the Detroit guys, a guy named Bill Pompilly, who was the inside man at the last casino that the Detroit mob built and controlled, was the Edgewater.
Yes, the Edgewater. Yeah.
And there was a lot of surveillance from, let's say, 79, 80 through 83, 84, when that was all being done. Pompilly died before the case hit, but it seems strange to me that you didn't bring, or that not you, but the feds didn't bring the case sooner, because it looked like through Pompilly and the surveillance of Pompilly and knowing what was going on, that there could have been a case brought, let's say, in the mid 80s to the late 80s, just on Edgewater. And it wasn't brought. It made me think possibly, and Bill Pompilly's been dead now for 35 years, but it made me think that Bill Pompilly was somehow working with the government and they didn't want to bring the case while he was still alive. And Rick has no comment on that. But you just look at a lot of the government files and what was being gleaned in 81, 82, and Pompilly. Did you ever meet him?
No, never met Pompilly. I didn't do much business in Toledo.
So Pompilly was a Toledo racketeer who was a pit boss, I think, at the Aladdin, or had something to do with the Aladdin. And then when the Aladdin...
You know what? Now you said that, I may have met him in Vegas at the Aladdin.
He went out there in the 70s at some point when a lot of the Toledo guys did
70s.
in the Aladdin.
Yeah.
Went from the frontier with your uncle.
Correct. Now I do believe I met him in Las Vegas.
And then they took over the Aladdin, and then when they got busted in the Aladdin, Pompilly conceives this. It was actually a pretty sharp angle to play here, where he's like, all the eyes are in Las Vegas. Let's go build a hotel and casino 90 miles away in Laughlin, where there are less prying eyes. And it was a payday, man.
Yeah.
They stole like $12 million from in early 80s money in a matter of like 18 months or 19 months, and then sold the place and got, was in and out and made a lot of money.
Smart moves.
Yeah.
Good move.
Yeah.
So I guess to make it more general, like a lot of the stuff that was charged in 96 was some of the stuff was going on in the 70s.
Yeah, because
with the casinos.
Yeah, with the RICO statute, you can buy back, and you can go back in 5-year increments, and you can connect those things that otherwise under other forms of prosecution wouldn't be possible. So yeah, it's a huge tool, and it's extraordinarily powerful, especially RICO conspiracy. It makes it a whole lot easier to prosecute organized or disorganized activity if you can find an enterprise and then go back.
So the activity in game tax, was charged in March of 96. Some of the predicate acts dated all the way back to the late 60s, early 70s.
Yes.
With the infiltration of the Frontier, and then the Aladdin, and then the Edgewater.
Yes, only by the use of the RICO statute.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are your kind of first memories of getting on the case? I mean, at Nove, the famous bug in Nove's car, I think went up in 92, I believe, or late 91.
I don't remember.
I think it was 91.
Might have been 91.
Because Nove came back to Detroit in
91.
91.
Yeah, I'd been released from prison. And I came back. I was still under supervised release, but then we had a little legal problem. The parole officer wanted to violate me. And
for meeting with people you shouldn't have met with?
Yeah. And I told her, check your paperwork. I didn't sign this mandatory release forms. So what do you mean? I said, that agrees that I would go on probation to the end of the sentence. I said, I MR'd, which means I did my whole sentence.
Yeah. You
have no jurisdiction over me. Go in front of a judge. And I walked out. And that was it. She had because I refused. I had been advised that in prison by another gentleman by the name of Belstreri, who was an attorney in Milwaukee. Well, he said, do not sign mandatory.
He was an attorney, but he was also, according to the government, a high-ranking mob figure. His dad was the godfather.
And he was, and he advised me, do not sign your mandatory.
Johnny Bell, right? Was it Johnny Bell?
Yeah, Johnny Belstreri. And he said, in fact, prior to game tax, I had contacted Johnny Belstreri a few times, and he gave me some advice, incidentally, which Peter Belanca never would even consider as
and Peter Belanca was one of the Tocco's attorneys?
Yeah, Jack Tocco and him were very close.
And the Belancas, I believe, I don't know if it was Peter, but there were some Belancas that were indicted in some of those casino cases, Frontier and
Peter
Aladdin.
Belanca. Peter Belanca was indicted in the Frontier case.
Okay.
I was in Las Vegas with Peter Belanca when they cut the deal for the Frontier.
To see the entire 90-minute interview and other great content, become a Patreon member today for just $5 at patreon.com/original gangsters.
So I would say that the two biggest dominoes to fall in the investigation fall in the direction of the government and helping them build a case was Angelo Polizzi and then the bug in the car. And that bug was up for 2-3 years.
Yeah. The bug was in there for a long time.
So I got all the transcripts, and they go from like 91 to 94.
Yeah. You know who the guy was who was designated to go through every second of every tape was me.
That had to be boring.
It was boring.
Nove and Pauly,
I mean,
guys talking shop for 3 years.
Oh man, who makes the best sauce, and you know how many breadcrumbs you put in a meatball, and I mean it was, but you know, that case, that the wires were the interesting thing to me was the way they were done. You know, you were being surveilled. If you got too far away, the audio would break. You know, so they had to be pretty close to you during that whole time. It was extraordinarily manpower intensive.
And Nove's saying that he was having his car swept for bugs, and they were obviously missing it.
Yeah.
They were missing it because I believe you guys could turn those bugs off or make them to a frequency that they couldn't detect.
As a matter of fact, just as a total aside, in the case I had in the early 90s with Lorenzo Viviano and
Tony Palazzolo.
Yeah. They would do walk and talks, and they were very shrewd, very careful. And so they'd walk through Greektown. So what we did was we put the parabolic mics in the parking meters. And so each one had a bug in the parking meter, and they'd turn it on, and they'd walk to the next one. They'd turn this one off and that one on, and that's how they pulled those audios off the street, off the walk and talks. It was fascinating. Even
the car bug, which went in 91, that was pretty early on in the government's strategy of trying to bug cars. I mean, I think the first major car to be bugged was in the mid 80s with the Lucchese mob boss, Tony Duck's Corallo, not Corrado, Anthony Corallo, aka Tony Ducks, who was the boss of the Lucchese's, was driving around in a Jaguar, 84, 85, and that was bugged. And, but I think that was kind of like the tip of the iceberg where people said, oh, this is a very productive way to glean.
Yeah. Well, Anthony Zerilli's car was bugged, and so he went into a hotel to meet with Paramore. And while he was in there, the Bureau takes his vehicle, puts it in the back of a semi, and started to go to town on it. And he came out and noticed his car was gone, and reported it stolen. So the Bureau took the car down to the, near the Detroit River, stripped it out and left it there, and as if it were a stolen vehicle. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Wow. Yeah. Do you remember when his car was stolen when he was at the hotel?
Yeah, vaguely.
Yeah.
Vaguely.
Yeah.
So can we just maybe talk about some of the, inside baseball of building the case? Nove's bug was up for 3 years, and then it took another 2 years for the case to drop. What are your memories of those years before the actual indictment?
Well, as I said, I was not associated with the case until very late in the game.
Okay.
And so I came on just a few months before, and
you came on a couple months before, but then they have you in the front lines prosecuting it.
Yeah, because that was so. I was a tough, energetic, hardworking. I felt like it was a mission. It was, I was a true believer, 100%. I believed qui pro domina justitia sequitur, which is on the Great Seal. I lived it. I breathed it. I loved it. I would have done it for free. I even had no idea how much money I was making. It just didn't concern me. So I was, 24/7 in the job. And when I got assigned to that, when I, told Keith, look, you help me out on this terrorism case, which I couldn't get anyone to help on. And I'll throw my hat in the ring. And then when I was in, I was all in. And that was what, that was my role in the strike force. I was the guy who agents would come to. They could call me at home if they had a search warrant. I mean, that was me, and that was totally different from any of the other attorneys in the strike force. So when I got on that case, I moved and shook, and that was, I had to steep myself and learn every inch of that case. And by the time it went to trial, I was, I believed I knew the facts better and the law better than any attorney in that courtroom. And the big part of it was preparing Angelo for trial. And he was probably, if not one of the most difficult witnesses I ever had. My personal.
You felt conflicted?
No, he was. I don't know what other word to use. He just was an incredible pussy. I don't know what else to say.
All right, I gotcha.
I mean, he was. We go from sessions where he'd be crying in the bed to, where he'd be coherent, but it was very difficult to focus him in. He was.
Was he worried that like Jack Tocco was going to kill him?
Yeah, that was his constant worry. He was scared to testify in general, just to be up in front of people. It was very difficult to get him focused. And so, my personal preference in the way I work cases, and I consider myself a trial attorney, which is very different than being a litigator. But, I know my way around a courtroom. And so for every 15 minutes a witness is on the witness stand, I believe they need about an hour of prep time.
Right.
That's just my general rule. And so if you consider how long he was on the witness stand, days, it took countless hours. I'd be in a hotel room with 2 FBI agents and Angelo, and sometimes his attorney. And, and that's why I believe the other attorney really got off the case. Ultimately, he just couldn't deal with it. So it was a tough time dealing with Angelo.
And so even though Angelo was a conduit to building the case, and the bug in Nove's car was a huge deal in building the case, neither of them, even Nove, and I say this with all due respect to Nove, Nove wasn't the main target in the case. They wanted to get build their way up the ladder, and the main targets here were Jack Tocco, Tony Zerilli, and the Jagaloney brothers, and Mike Polizzi, and Tony Tocco. Right. Yeah. So the top of the lineup, the guys on the marquee.
Yeah. Clearly. Yep.
Did you? Was there ever any discussion about bringing more violence into the indictments, charging murders?
Well, there were other indictments. I know that. There was a second tier of indictments,
yes.
and those. Just to give you an example of how sometimes incompetence overruled almost everything else. So that second tier of indictments, it was a time when they were going to be superseded, and when they superseded the second tier, they left off some people that were included in that indictment. There were 19 or something like
16
that.
16 at the end. It was 16.
Yeah, okay. It was okay at the end, but I think there were 19, and it was whatever they superseded, and they simply forgot to add.
There were some unindicted co-conspirators.
No, I'm talking about indicted. So there was indictment A, and then they superseded with indictment B. But in indictment B, they just forgot to include some people, if you can believe it. And then when they realized that the people that were excluded accidentally, the statute of limitations had run, and they weren't charged. It was amazing incompetence.
We can get into this a little later, and I'd like to get just to tease it out here. There was some possible shadiness in a lot of parts of that case, and I don't think they came from the U.S. Attorney's Office necessarily, but just in the way that things shook out in the laundry, Jack Tocco's sentence, and other stuff.
How so?
Well, again, I think we're jumping around here, but I'll jump on it right now. But Jack Tocco's convicted of being the head of a RICO enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Every other Mafia don over the previous 15 years that had been convicted of being the head of a RICO enterprise was going away for 25 years plus.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack Tocco gets a sentence of, a year and a half. Prosecutors appeal it, get him to go back there for like another year. But at the end of the day, he ends up doing less than 2 years.
Well, it wasn't the U.S. Attorney's Office that was responsible. It was the judge.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I was saying. I don't think it was you guys. I think it was, there was some questions about.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I'd never seen anything like that in 35 years of practicing law where a judge was so adamant about departing downward on the sentencing guidelines. So he did that more than once. It went back up to the Sixth Circuit. They remanded it. He did it again. It went back to the Sixth Circuit. He was just committed not to follow the sentencing guidelines. And that was not the Department of Justice.
No. I wanted to be clear that I hope I said that before I opened it, and if I didn't, I apologize. But yeah, I'm not. I wasn't trying to throw shade at the U.S. Attorney's Office, but just talking to people, and then we can get Nove's take on this. There was a lot of people that read Jack's demeanor in court over those couple months. And guys that were in the trial, guys that were observing, that just felt like he knew that he had some ace up his sleeve, that there was, I've heard you use the word trap door, where he knew that even if he got convicted, he was going to be okay. That he kind of, the way he carried himself was kind of like he had an in.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a couple of interactions with him during the trial that were interesting. One was in the hallway at a break when he told me when this is through, he invited me to a nice spaghetti dinner. He was very pleasant, cordial, dignified, always. I thought
that was his reputation. He was a very refined, polished. He was a boardroom don, not a street corner don.
Yeah. Now Tawn was mean as spit.
And Tawn was Jack would bark and Tawn would bite.
Yeah. But one time
nobody has an objection.
Oh.
Tawn was not my favorite person, but I don't think Tawn was tough when Tony the Bull was in the room.
Yeah.
And that's from childhood.
Wow, that's interesting.
I was surprised to hear, and again, you don't have to comment on it if you don't want to. Everybody's dead that I'm talking about here, but I was surprised to hear, and this kind of contradicts what I said a moment ago, so I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here, that the royals in the family weren't necessarily tasked with a lot of the dirty work, but I was told that Tony Tocco did quite a bit of dirty work in his time and had a lot of bodies and I just wouldn't, when you talk about Jack Tocco and bodies, you're really talking about one or two situations when he was really young. But I'd heard about from people that, Tony Tocco was doing work into later in his life.
Well, I don't know. I had heard that too, but it was not reflected in.
No, there were no murders. So just to be clear, there were no murders in game tags.
Nor were there any FD 302s that I've ever seen. FBI 302s that which is a historical memorialization of I'd seen none of that said Tawn was, but I had heard that from agents. The agents would say that what you just said, but there was no memorialization of it that I'd seen.
So Nove kind of has an idea this is coming down. Case was being built for, like we said, a long time. Different iterations of the investigation dating back 20 years. And by late 95, early 96, you guys are ready to bring the case.
Yeah.
What was the feeling amongst not just you, but other people? Like, was there just a sense as 95 became 96 that this thing is coming soon and we're going to have to deal with it?
There was a sense between me and Paul that we're coming soon. We did not realize how big or encompassing the case would be. And we knew there would be at least me and him and maybe a few of the guys who were working with us would be involved. And we knew it would be an extortion case. I didn't expect a RICO case.
Did you have these conversations with your uncle? Was Tony Z saying, was Tony Z wondering if it was going to blow back on him?
No, he did not wonder that. He knew that I was hotter than a firecracker, and so was Paul. And I mean, that didn't surprise anybody. I did not think that they would build a RICO case going back to Jack Tocco. Then realizing that with some of the conversations in our car would institute bringing Jack in. I'd never had a conversation in my car with Tony Tocco or Jack Tocco, but there were conversations about them going to meetings, and in those conversations, those tapes, I mean, it becomes very apparent that
you guys don't like them.
I'm disgusted with the whole concept that they're playing, and that's the way it goes down. I was surprised the day that the RICO conspiracy went so far as to arresting people in Florida. I was shocked that my father was involved in the RICO conspiracy.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. Do you mind? No. Paul Tocco was involved in that case, and you say that Paul really was not your dad.
Yeah, my father.
That
never did anything
wasn't really a
illegal
wise guy.
No.
No. Did he end up having to do time in this?
No. I got an attorney to bargain him down because how my father got involved with the case was so stupid. And I'm a little bit aggravated that the Justice Department would bring a case against a man like that. He asked me to pick him up at the dealership because he brought his car for service. When I picked him up, I said, come on, I got to go to the west side. I'll buy you a corned beef sandwich because my dad liked corned beef or pastrami. And on the way, I says, listen, Dad, I got to stop just to wait in the car for me. I'll be right out. I said, but be ready to go real fast. Don't go roaming around. I go in, and I had to pick up some money from a couple of the guys who testified against me in the trial, both guys. And
some of the Chaldean bookmakers.
Yeah, 2 Chaldean guys. And I got in the car with my dad. I said, come on, let's go. He said, everything okay? I said, yeah, Dad, don't worry about it. Let's go. And he ends up getting indicted.
There was also one other thing, and I don't know if this played a role in bringing him into the case, and we'll get Rick's take on it in a second. But I know, and I've brought this up in some other videos we've done, I know that there was a conversation that your dad was picked up on with you, and I think Paul, maybe your uncle, where you were in the car and you're talking about the Tocco, Bowman, Jackie Jagaloney beef and how they're trying to get you to go at Tocco, and your dad's advising you, go see Tony Jagaloney.
Yes. That I do remember that conversation. That's right. But you got to remember, my father knew Tony Jagaloney from childhood, long before Tony Jagaloney was involved in anything. They grew up in the same neighborhood. Their parents were in the same business. My father was in the produce business. And a lot of times I would ask advice from my father, especially when I had meetings with like Pete Vitale or Jimmy Q, because they talked a lot in Italian. And I wanted to make sure that I understood their meanings, because sometimes in the Sicilian dialect, there's subtle undertones to them.
Oh, huge differences.
Yeah, there's subtle undertones to what is being said and what is being meant.
Yeah.
Where my father had a complete understanding of that. His original language was the Sicilian dialect. And he advised me at that time, because I'm concerned, so was Paul, that we didn't like being pushed at Tocco Bowman for no reason. He wasn't interfering with us. He was not in my way. He was not in Paul's way as far as making a buck on the streets. And we were getting pushed that way. And
what do you mean by that?
They wanted him to kill him.
They wanted us to
kill Tocco Bowman. They had the contract.
Anyway, my father says, go see Tony Jagaloney.
He'll solve it. He'll fix it.
And Tony Jagaloney will be honest with you, because I've told you this before. Tony Jagaloney, I never lied to the man. I never shaded my conversations with him. I told him straight out the truth, and he gave me advice and straight out the truth.
Do you remember this beef that it came up in the case where allegedly Jackie Jagaloney had an issue with Tocco Bowman and wanted to whack Tocco Bowman for infringing on dice games and backdoor casinos, and then it never happened. It eventually got squashed, but there were bugs. The bug in the car had them talking about this.
Yeah, sure. A lot of things in that case never happened.
Right.
Which was a big part of the kind of the allure of the case was that you had the family, the aristocracy
of the Detroit underworld,
the universe of the Sicilian Mafia in the United States,
Right.
Was here in Detroit. And it was, so I don't want to say it was all sizzle and no steak, because that would be an overstatement, but it was a case built on nuance, interconnections, a lot of a historical case, that if you took any piece of the case or pieces of the case, for instance, when you guys, exploded the device, that
I did not explode the device.
No, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes,
that became, a bomb. And,
Was that the John Carlo situation?
Yeah.
What might have been intended. Okay.
We talked about this on our last.
There's two different situations here, but go ahead.
We've addressed it. We addressed this on a video we did a week or so ago. Going
out and testing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was probably not much more than an M80 or a M60 or whatever, those little bombs are, those little, quarter stick of dynamite. But it became, something much larger in the scheme of the case.
Well, and it's, you don't want to be living in a community where someone's mad at somebody else and trying to extort somebody else, and they blow up or shoot at their house or blow up their house. I mean, that's...
Or shooting at the store when you guys were sitting across the street from, and you were going to shoot into, should we do it? Should we not do it? Yeah, no.
Shoot out the windows. And sitting as, the FBI was in an RV, they could have urinated on your car. They were so close. And you guys were going back and forth about should we, shouldn't we? And you took off and you came back. And, so when you take those things in seriatim, they're not serious things. They're not serious offenses, but, the specter of taking down the whole, Sicilian Mafia was overwhelming. And so taking a history of all of those incidents, compacting them together, it became a story of, a very powerful organized crime family. In that vein of things that look like they could have happened and maybe happened, bubbled a little bit, but didn't explode the way that they could, in those wires, you hear Nove and Pompilly talking about, what if we have to go to war?
Yeah.
Like thinking that the Toccos were going to try to kill Nove and Pompilly, and Nove and Pompilly sitting there in the car. I found this incredibly intriguing. It's before I haven't met Nove, and they're doing like a roster check of like who they have on their side,
right,
who they can rely on, who can we go get, who would this guy be with us, or would this guy be with? So I mean, it was, pretty serious to get to the point where you're even having those conversations.
It was beginning to get very serious.
Yeah.
And probably would have gotten a lot more serious had it not been the case. And that's true. The only thing that I had some questions about was some of the testimony, not by some of the FBI agents, and I don't remember his name. It wasn't the immediate people on my case, suggesting that hypothetical situations that me and Paul would talk about, and that became evidence that we were going to do
the conspiracy.
We were going to kill a police officer. That was never an intention.
But they under the law, and there's the federal rule is 801 D2E. It's a co-conspirator statement by a co-conspirator, which becomes non-hearsay, and that becomes evidence. So there's it was an important part of the case to show the enterprise, the existence of the enterprise, how it functioned, how it was utilized, the hierarchical structure of the enterprise, and the co-conspirator statements were important too. So, for instance, there were a lot of conversations in the car about John Carlo Cantanucci.
That's his real name, John Cantanucci.
Yeah,
right.
John Carlo.
I don't know. I know his name is John Carlo. I didn't know.
It's a construction company. His real name isn't John Carlo.
No,
the company's called John Carlo.
Yeah. It may be Catanacci.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And the discussions back and forth. I mean, if you listen to those in a vacuum, they were brutal. Should we kill him? No, don't kill him. break his legs, make him so he can't move or walk,
And Tony Z was giving some of this instruction to Nove and Pauly.
And then I can't remember the guy. It's a martial artist who played baseball too, that you guys were going to go to have the actual. What was his name?
The young guy?
Yeah,
it was
young
Witcher.
kid.
Frankie Witcher?
It was Witcher. Yeah,
Witcher.
Witcher, yeah. Right? Witcher?
Yeah, Frank Witcher.
He died a couple years ago.
Oh, okay. So I mean, it was no joke. If you're listening to that, it was a plan and scheme to kick
that one. I
life
understand.
out of.
That one I understood. It was the one hypothetical situation that me and Paul are planning to kill cops, or the way it was presented in court.
Cops or FBI agents?
Anybody, police or FBI agents, and shooting out windows and getting pulled over would have not been considered a dire situation where you'd have court on the street.
Yeah,
You never shot out the windows of a cop's house?
No.
Right.
That's not what I mean. I mean, there was a conversation in the car that if we had to do some serious work and you got stopped on the way out,
right. Okay, yeah.
and you might as well have court on the street. That was hypothetical, but that was depicted along with some of the defense attorneys in our case that me and Paul were mad dog killers.
Well, rightfully so. With all due respect, because you're what's in your heart and mind is unknown to the listener, other than what you're saying, and you're saying away.
If it's done in context, they know what's in their heart and mind.
But Nove, just to play devil's advocate, one of the famous lines from a defense attorney is talking about how brutal having to deal with a tape on your client is. You can't cross-examine a wire.
Right.
Like the wire speaks for itself. There's no way that.
All right.
And I'm sure you'll agree. Sitting there in the sterility of the courtroom, in ultra silence, and hearing your voice being played over a loudspeaker to a jury, it takes on a totally different context.
Okay,
it's powerful.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, really, you can't. I mean, and not to reemphasize it, but like a tape is so dangerous. I mean,
it is.
Getting caught on a tape and having that tape played in front of a jury is it's such a trump card because
it is. It's the witness testifying.
Yeah,
literally testifying.
Right,
as if you're on the witness stand. It's an admission.
And as Nove, and then now to Nove's point, which is true too, I think context can be lost, and it can be lost in the sense of giving you, the person that's saying it, the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
like the benefit of the doubt that he's not. They're just talking tough. But when it's being played and it's raw, unadulterated, the words, you don't have any of that context.
Yeah.
Well, you're true, and then that's where some of our defense attorneys fell down on their job.
Yeah. Well, I know a big part of the defense for you and Pauly was, with all due respect, you're just kind of just buffoonish, talking about sauce, talking about where you're going to eat, talking about trying to blow up something that was nothing more than a couple of firecrackers in a can. It's not a bomb. And I think in particular, Bob Morgan was very effective, Pauly's attorney.
Well, I agree with you. Bob Morgan was one of the better attorneys on the case.
He really was.
If not the best one in our case specifically, I think Harold Gerowitz was a very effective attorney.
Gerowitz is an excellent attorney as well. He is a very good attorney. But
I believe some of the other attorneys in our case, their cross-examinations, when there was any, was pointing to me and Paul.
So would you say that, would you agree from a perspective of being on the prosecutor's table that on the other side you had and I'm asking you if this is true, I don't know if it's true, I'm asking your opinion on it, that there was a concerted effort by Jack and Tawn and that side of the case to push everything onto Nove and Pauly.
Yeah,
like this was Nove and Pauly's, had nothing to do with us.
No doubt.
And they got thrown under the bus in court.
And it was a concerted effort by us to make sure that wasn't an effective defense. But that is what, was the clear sense in that courtroom throughout, was that these guys pulled us in. They're the culpable figures. We're just, a group of...
it really wasn't a consolidated defense where all the defense attorneys were working in coordination to help the greater good. It was kind of like divide and conquer.
Even in the motions practice, you could see that, where there were, the motions were drafted to kind of depict and push things off on Nove and Pompilly.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most... I don't know if eloquent's the right way to describe it, but the part of the wire which kind of says it all was at the end of one of these conversations that you guys were having about who would be with who if things went violent. I think it was you, I'm pretty sure it was you, who said, you know what, at the end of the day, I actually don't think anything's going to happen because my uncle, who's 7 years old, has been brought up to not want his relatives shooting it out on the street when everybody should be collecting their Social Security. Something along those lines, like that's not the way that this thing was built. My grandfather, the way that your uncle would never go along with some type of violent dispute because who wants to have you and your cousins trying to kill each other and have the newspapers covering it.
I don't remember that conversation, but that would have been something I might have said, yes.
No. You think at the time, you think your uncle could have stopped something from developing?
No, I think they would have taken him out too.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, at that point there was no love lost between Jack and,
I think
Tony Z.
He might have gone there try to protect me, but he would have been.
That would be my sense too.
Because I know that the rift had become that big.
And Tony Z was separated from the trial. So let's kind of get to the actual March 98, the trial, or I think it started in February and ended at the end of March, I believe.
I think it was like January.
So maybe it starts in January, ends in March.
I want to say April, but
okay,
I think it was April.
Okay, so
it was
wrong
a long
again.
trial.
3 months.
It was a long trial.
3 months.
A long trial.
Some of the big players are separated. So Tony Zerilli gets separated out. He doesn't go to trial to 2002.
His health was
Tony Jagaloney had health issues. He gets out of the case. He dies before he can go to trial. Billy Jagaloney pleads out and allocutes in order to get a shortened sentence, which was somewhat controversial, where he was the first member of the Mafia in Detroit to go in front of an open court and acknowledge that there was a Tocco Zerilli crime family, that he was a part of it. And that got him a 6-year sentence as opposed to what would have been a 15, 20-year sentence. And he was already old and would have died in prison if he didn't do that. So when trial hits in January 98, it's Tony Tocco, Jack Tocco, Nove, Pompilly. Was Mike Polisi?
No.
All
Corrado.
Mike Polisi had died.
Tony the Bull Corrado.
Yeah.
Right. Mike Polisi died in 97. You're right. So that's another person that was indicted that didn't make it to the trial.
Right.
So the big names, I guess, would have been Tony the Bull, Jack Tocco, Tony Tocco.
Correct.
Were the big names
Yes.
at the trial.
Yes.
Tony Tocco ends up being acquitted. He's the only one that's acquitted in the case.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Why was he acquitted? I honestly, this is something that I've actually never really discussed with an attorney on the case. I know he was acquitted, but I wasn't really sure what the reasoning behind it was.
He was not the testimony adduced at trial was not as far-reaching into his involvement clearly as the others.
Did you catch him on any wires?
No.
The Toccos were pretty conscious of
very
being surveilled.
Very.
Audio
the old
surveillance.
school guys were always conscious of that.
So what are your memories of the first part of that trial, opening arguments, and what was the vibe? I know that was at a point now where the Detroit media was still covering OC. I'm the only one left. The mainstream doesn't really, the mainstream news here doesn't really report on this stuff 30 years later. But back then, They were. There was a lot of coverage on the news and
A
the
lot of
newspaper.
coverage. I think it was front page just about every day, if not every day. It was a dynamic, incredibly well attended. The courtroom was always packed every day. There were the testimony went in unimpeded. There were a couple of things that we prepared for that never came to fruition that we were concerned about in the presentation of evidence. One was the photograph, for instance, of
Jack Tocco photograph.
Of Jack Tocco being made
the boss.
The boss was taken by Special Agent Stachel, who had, by all admission, trespassed on the grounds of the game farm, and he crawled on his belly. And
just for people that don't know that are watching this, there was a very famous FBI photo that was snapped in the summer of 1979 at the Timberland Game Ranch, which was up by Ann Arbor.
Yeah, Dexter, I think.
Dexter, it was a meeting held to elect Jack Tocco the boss, the next boss of the family. It was about a year and a half after Nove's grandfather had passed away, who had been the Don for 40 years. And all the capos that were free, Tony Jack was locked up at that point, but all the capos that were free all went up to the game ranch and they voted Jack in as boss. And they had like a little bit of a celebration.
Yeah.
They were out on a patio.
Right.
FBI got tipped off to the fact that this was going on, and Greg Stachel goes on the property without a search warrant,
right,
and snaps this photo, which became pretty historic.
So, and incidentally, it came about kind of fortuitously. The FBI, they were out on surveillance, on kind of routine surveillance, and they noticed people collecting up and heading out. They knew something was going on because all these people, everyone was who had never gotten together
Frank
before.
the Bomb was going around in a van, picking people up and driving them up there.
Yeah, who had never been together before, right, in one meeting. So that's what led to the
Nove,
hypervigilance.
Were you in summer of '79? Were you here?
No, I was living in Arizona.
Did you hear about this this event?
Yeah, I heard about it.
And Tony Z was not there.
Yes,
he would not go there.
Yeah, he was not there.
Yeah.
So during the trial, I knew that would be a huge part of cross-examination of Stachel, and some of the others in the office thought that it can't be brought up. It's outside the scope. It's outside the scope of his testimony. But I knew that would come up in cross-examination. I knew the judge would let it in as well. So people were telling me you don't have to prepare him. Stachel, you don't have to worry about him being crossed on that because it's, quote, outside the scope of direct examination, which was not under the rules of evidence available for cross. Well, of course, they cross-examined him extensively on it. He was well prepared for it. And so those things that normally in a trial, you're always expecting the unexpected. You're worried about certain pieces of evidence coming in the way you want them to, and other pieces not getting in at all, et cetera. I mean, trial is like warfare. And so in that vein, there was nothing in that trial that was impeded as to the inclusion of evidence. There was nothing unexpected that came in or didn't come in. And so it was a pretty smoothly run affair.
To see the entire 90-minute interview and other great content, become a Patreon member today for just $5 at patreon.com/original gangsters.